Story 1. Probably Aaliyah. Like, yo, your life is more valuable than equipment. Just stay one more night on the island and wait for a bigger plane that can carry you and the equipment. Story 2. I would warn my 14-year-old best friend not to meander in the middle of the road that day after school. She was hit by a car and pronounced brain dead shortly after. I miss her and often wonder how her life would have turned out had she lived. Miss you, Kelly. Story 3. I would love to be able to do this with a second save slot just to see the effects. Warn Caesar about the assassination. The second triumvirate never forms, Rome does not splinter under another civil war, and Octavian isn't declared princeps by the Senate. Warn Ferdinand, or at least his driver, not to turn down that street. World War I is delayed. Perhaps Germany isn't forced to take the blame and sign the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler never rises to power. Warn Philip II about his bodyguard. Alexander does not become king yet. Philip conquers Asia Minor and then forges peace with the Achaemenid, negating Alexander's spread of Hellenism that influenced the entire Western world. Warn Ethelred I about the battle which caused his fatal wounds. He lives long enough for his son to become heir, removing Alfred the Great from the line. Without Alfred, the Danes conquer England and eventually all of Britain. With paganism now the main religion, Christianity's spread in Northern Europe is delayed by centuries, perhaps even undone in continental Europe by the constant raiding and warfare of the Vikings. Story 4. Steve Irwin, hands down. He was such a formative force for good and the caretaking of nature that was taken before his time for so many people. Just be like, hey man, please don't hang out with stingrays without some chest protection, and keep on wrestling those crocs, mate. Story 5. My dad. When I was 15, he was diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer, glioblastoma. 7 months later, he passed away. The worst part is that 2 years prior, he had a stroke, one of the symptoms of the cancer, and in the CT scan they did after his miraculous recovery, you could see the tumor, but the doctors misdiagnosed it as blood that hadn't been soaked up yet. I would give anything to speak to him again, to hug him, and certainly to warn him at a time when it could have still been preventable. Story 6. I will warn Naya Rivera not to go boating that day with her son. Her death shook me to the core. She managed to save her poor little boy and ended up dying. I can't listen to If I Die Young without thinking of her. Story 7. I would warn John O'Neill that he was going to die in the September 11th attacks. He was the head of security at the World Trade Center, had helped stop the 1993 attack on them, investigated Al-Qaeda, and was worried about a future potential attack. If he knew the time and date of the attack, he could have done a lot to prevent people in the towers from dying and might have had Federal Bureau of Investigation contacts who maybe could stop the whole thing. September 11th would still have been a tragedy if they hit empty towers or less full towers, but it would be way less of a tragedy if it was just a building and not thousands of people. Not to mention the retaliatory loss of life with all the military actions that took place afterward. Story 8. The British soldier in World War I who had a German messenger in his sights but did not fire and kill him. The man that the soldier did not kill was Adolf Hitler. Story 9. Probably Robert Kennedy. I kind of wanted to say John, but I feel like Robert Kennedy would have had a bigger impact. He would have served well into the 1970s and probably managed the malaise years a bit better. Plus, no Nixon. What would the GOP be like today if McCarthy was as bad as they ever got? Story 10. The teenager who was on the Titan submersible. I am not sure how much difference it would make since he was reportedly terrified to get in the thing, but he didn't deserve that. Story 11. I would tell little James not to leave his mommy's side in the mall. And if 2 older boys approach you to play, to run to your mommy as fast as you can. United Kingdom. Story 12. My mom smoked and didn't take care of her mental health. Her heart stopped last year when she was a few months shy of 67. My daughter had only just turned 4, and I turned 40 the following April. I am both sad and angry at her and probably will be for the rest of my life. If I could go back and invade her dreams to get her to stop smoking, I would. Story 13. Christina Grimmie. I was watching her YouTube videos for years, saw she got on The Voice, and was thrilled to hear she got a record deal. Still tugs at my heart thinking of her being gone. Story 14. My dad, so he would know that he was going to have a heart attack and make sure he took care of himself or at least got to a good hospital. Alternatively, my father-in-law and just go ahead and call the ambulance during his heart attack. True, my husband and I would have never met if his life hadn't changed so drastically after his dad died. But knowing the empty place in his soul he has for his father, just like I do for mine, I would do anything to give that to him. Story 15. Judith Barcy and her mother, Maria Barcy. Here's a link to read about Judith's story if interested. Please visit the Wikipedia page on Judith Barcy for more information. Story 16. I would have told Richie Valens not to hop on that plane. He won a coin toss with Buddy Holly's guitarist and ended up getting a seat on the aircraft that would eventually be his demise. He was 17 when he died and was so supremely talented. He could have changed the face of rock music forever had he lived. Story 17. I would warn Chris Watt's poor wife and children, as well as Scott Peterson's wife. Honestly, there are so many victims of senseless and disgusting murders I wish I could warn. I could write a list. Story 18. My best friend took her own life with her husband's gun in October of 2020. She had been struggling for a long time but had married her best friend 2 years prior, bought a tiny house, and her life seemed like it was becoming so full. I know it seems like a waste to warn someone about themselves. She always struggled with her image and self-worth. But when we were in our early 20s, she had a gastric bypass surgery that deeply affected her health and self-esteem and compounded the effects of her substance abuse. To this day, I can't believe a doctor ever performed surgery like that on such a young, healthy woman. If I can't go back in time to confront that doctor, I would like to go back and beg her not to do it. Tell her how beautiful she always was and always will be to me. I love you, Jesse, and me and the girls miss you. Always. Story 19. Karen Carpenter. I'm pretty sure people weren't as aware of the dangers of Ipecac back then. From all accounts, she seemed to have finally found a will to live. Too late. Maybe warning her early enough would have convinced her to find some other, less dangerous coping mechanism. It doesn't sound like she expected it to kill her. She doesn't sound like she was doing it for suicidal reasons. Eating disorders are hell? Sure, but with proper treatment you can get through them. 20 years later, she probably would have survived. Her death was a terribly preventable tragedy. Also, I wish I could get more Carpenter's music and more of her own solo music. Story 20. Johnny Gaudreau. My favorite hockey player was recently killed with his brother, Matthew, by a drunk driver while they were out biking. It was the night before his sister's wedding. Johnny and Matthew both left behind 2 unborn children, and Johnny had 2 other children as well. Johnny was described as the ultimate family man and took a pay cut to play for the Columbus Blue Jackets, a team that isn't exactly famous for signing big-name free agents, so he could raise his family in Columbus. It's rumored that Columbus was a good fit for his wife to pursue her career in the medical field. The ultimate family man that nobody had a bad thing to say about. Gone too soon. I didn't even touch on his hockey skill because of how good of humans he and his brother were. Johnny Hockey was an absolute stud on the ice too. I would tell both men not to go out on that bike ride. Rest in peace, and please have the family in your thoughts and prayers. Story 21. Martin Luther King Jr. Had he not passed away, Black individuals would have had much better leadership for the decades following and would be in a better position today socially and economically. The people who filled the vacuum left by his death exploited Black individuals under the guise of helping them and continue to do so. Story 22. My grandma had been abusing alcohol and opiates for years by that point, but it rapidly affected her after her breast cancer chemotherapy. I wish I could have told her that at 18 or 19, I'd be holding her hand in the hospital, telling her how sorry I was after she burned through her stomach. I wish I'd spent more time with her, been able to help her see what she was doing would end her life so relatively young, in her mid-60s, cancer-free by that point. I wish she had seen me graduate college and go to graduate school since I graduated during COVID and had no formal celebration. She will never meet my fiancé or my future child. She won't see me graduate from my master's and into my dream full-time job, the way she always hoped for me. And her death led to the spiral that killed my grandpa the next year. I miss them so much. Story 23. Definitely Paul Wellstone. Such a bright future for such an amazing man in politics. I used to go to summer camp right down the road from his memorial in northern Minnesota where his plane crashed. I could imagine him ending up in the presidency very easily. Story 24. Xi Jinping and I would tell him that betrayal would come from inside his cabinet when he least expects it. Just make him spend every minute looking over his shoulder. Story 25. I would go to Robin Williams and tell him his mind betrays him to the extreme. He dies afraid, not knowing he has a daughter or wife. The cognitive decline starts slowly, but eventually, the inability to sleep takes hold as the more extreme degradation is just around the corner. That would be his last opportunity to go out on his own terms. Story 26. Steve Irwin. To be killed by a stingray after years of saving crocodiles was insane. A good guy and a fantastic conservationist who should not have gone diving that day. Story 27. I would warn my grandfather that his treacherous brother was unhinged and plotting to kill him. Despite my troubled relationship with my father, I would warn him to be healthier and take it easy before his heart attack happens. Story 28. This assumes the recipient of the information will listen. My first thought, for some reason, is Jim Croce, but I doubt, as much as I'd appreciate more Croce songs, that he's the best choice. What about warning Archduke Franz Ferdinand about the assassin who would end up starting World War I? Story 29. Mac Miller. Warn him that the oxycodone pills he bought that night were pressed with fentanyl. I would have been able to meet him and thank him for saving my life and accompanying me through the roughest patches. Still listening to him every day. Rest in peace, Easy Mac with the cheesy raps. Story 30. Easy. Marie Curie, if she had only known radioactivity would cause her cancer, which killed her, maybe she could have lived long enough to discover even more scientific breakthroughs. Story 31. Mac Miller. He was one of my favorite rappers growing up, and people told me I looked just like him, too. And honestly, his song Self-Care, after his death, just hit so incredibly hard.